Hello, we're now on the 11th presentation for the syntax seminar, and this time we'll be looking at some phenomena that we haven't yet touched on, called raising and control. We actually have two different types of structures which look remarkably similar to each other. Let's first of all start off with a recap about the sentence structures that we've been looking at. We know that sentences are at the top end of the structure are CPs headed by a complementizer, which may or may not be overt. In the specifier position of the CP, we've got the place where WH elements move to from some position in the rest of the clause. That position is always empty before anything moves to it. Now, it may be filled by something that moves, but it doesn't have to be. So basically, in an interrogative, WH interrogative, that position is going to be filled by a WH phrase. In declaratives or other kinds of interrogatives, it'll just be left empty. Now, in its complement position, we've got the inflectional phrase. The inflectional phrase is headed by an inflection. And its specifier position, just like the CP's, is underlyingly empty and something moves to it. That's basically the subject position. The difference between this position and the specifier of the CP is that something always has to occupy this position. Inside the IP, then, we also have the verb phrase. Now, the verb phrase could be a simple thing where we have a one-place predicate, a verb, with one argument. And if that argument is a theme, this is all we need, just a verb phrase with its theme argument. However, not all verbs are like that. Some verbs are more complicated, particularly if they have an agent or an experiencer or something like that. In that case, we're going to need two verbal heads, an abstract one which isn't actually pronounced, that's the higher one, that's associated with this extra argument, and the lower one has got the theme in its specifier position. So any verb that has an agent or an experiencer will have a more complicated verb phrase. Now, last time we also looked at further expansion of the verb phrase, this time to include these extra verbal elements, either the perfect, the progressive, as we've got here, or the passive element. These are morphemes, bound morphemes, which build a verb phrase on top of the thematic verb phrase and come between the inflection and the main verb. Now, let's turn our attention back to the subject position. As I've said, the subject position, the specifier of the IP, is underlyingly empty at D structure. So we take a simple clause with one of these unaccusative verbs with just a theme argument. We start off with that theme inside the verb phrase, and the subject position, the specifier of the IP, is underlyingly empty. Now, that position has to be filled. So at S structure, what has to happen in this particular case is that subject has to move out of the VP, the theme element, into the subject position to fill it. And it's ungrammatical to leave the theme inside the VP and just have the subject position empty. Okay, so the sentence has to be John will arrive and not will John arrive. Note that's not supposed to be a question, it's not an inverted auxiliary there. The auxiliary doesn't move at all, and neither does the theme, and that's why it's ungrammatical. However, there's another way that we can fill a subject position to satisfy this requirement that that position have something in it. This happens when we've got verbs like seem, for example. Now, this kind of verb has a single argument, but this time it's a clause. And in that case, then, there's nothing really that can move into that subject position. There's no argument, DP argument, to move into the subject position. So what happens in this case is we fill that empty subject position with a meaningless subject, one of these what we call pleonastic subjects, and in this case that element is it. Again, note this has to happen. You can't leave that subject position empty and get may seem John is intelligent as um, an S structure. It has to be it may seem John is intelligent. Now, let's have a look at some more sentences. I'll put these two sentences up together because, well, they look very similar to each other, but as we will find out, they are actually different. But for now, let's look at the similarities. Okay, one of them is using a verb appear and the other one try. Okay, John can appear to be intelligent or John must try to be intelligent. Word for word, they look identical. We've got a subject, John, we've got an inflection, can and must, we've got the verb, appear and try, and then something following the verb to be intelligent in both cases. So they look very similar to each other. The first question we have to turn to is that thing that follows these verbs appear and try, to be intelligent. What kind of thing is that? Well, first thing to notice is that it isn't a preposition phrase. Even though it begins with a word that looks like a preposition, it actually isn't a preposition. And you can see that because you couldn't replace it with any other preposition. Okay, you can't say John can appear for be intelligent or with be intelligent or in be intelligent or any other. It has to be this word to that is used there. Furthermore, the thing that follows this word is a verb phrase, and prepositions never take VP complements. So this thing clearly isn't a preposition. What it is our well-known infinitive inflection. Okay, this is the to infinitive. So given that there's an inflection there, this thing that follows this verb to be intelligent actually is an inflectional phrase, at least an inflectional phrase, because we know that inflectional phrases are clauses, and clauses are always CPs too, so it's probably a CP. Okay, so what we've got then is following these verbs appear and try, we've got at least an IP. Okay, and we can see that in an example like we expect John to be intelligent. John to be intelligent is clearly a clause. However, that is different from the examples we started off with because at least in that case, John to be intelligent, we've got a subject in the specifier position of that lower IP. But of course, if we look back at these two structures, there appears to be no subject there. Appear to be intelligent. Where's the subject gone? Now, clearly that's a bit of a problem because we've seen in other cases that subject position has to be filled. Something has to occupy the specifier of the IP, and yet in these two cases it looks as though there's nothing there. Well, let's first look into the question of is that position really empty or is it just appear to be empty? One observation that we can bring to bear on this question is the fact that thematic roles have to be given to arguments. There's got to be an argument for every thematic role. Take a three-place predicate like to give, which has an agent, a goal, and a theme. I gave Mary the money. Each thematic role there is given to a particular argument. I is the agent, Mary is the goal, and the money is the theme. You can't miss these arguments out. So you can't say I gave the money and miss out the goal. And you can't say I gave Mary and miss out the theme. Or gave Mary the money and miss out the agent. Okay, so every thematic role must be borne by an argument. Now if we look back at our two examples, John appears to like Mary, we notice that in that lower IP we've got a verb like. And like is a two-place predicate. It has two arguments. An experiencer, the one who experiences the emotion of liking, and the theme, the one who is actually liked. So clearly there's got to be an element to bear that experiencer role. Okay, so there has to be a subject of these things, otherwise we wouldn't be able to explain why this is grammatical. If you think about the meaning of these sentences, in both cases it's the subject of the higher verb, John, which is interpreted as the one who is doing the liking. Okay, now another observation which not only shows that there is an argument, but also that that argument is in the subject position of the lower clause. And that's to do with this behavior of these types of pronouns known as reflexive pronouns, ones with words like self on them. The observation is this, that a reflexive pronoun has to refer to something which is in its own clause. That is, it has to have what we call an antecedent within its own clause. What I'm doing here is using these numerical subscripts, or what we call indexes, to indicate the reference of the pronoun. The pronoun has an index 1 and John has an index 1, and the idea is anything with the same index refers to the same thing. So Mary thinks John likes himself. John and himself refer to the same individual, so it means that John likes John. And note, that's perfectly okay. But if you put John into the upper clause and himself in the lower clause, then things aren't so good. John thinks Mary likes himself doesn't work with himself trying to refer to John. Essentially, himself has to refer to something, or has to have an antecedent within the same clause as itself. Now, if we show our examples and modify them to include a reflexive pronoun, we get something like John appears to like himself and John tries to like himself. Note, these are perfectly grammatical, and what's more, the himself refers to the subject of the higher clause. Now we know that's not possible by itself because reflexive pronouns have to have antecedents within their own clause. So this actually argues that there really is a subject of that lower clause there, we just can't see it. Okay. Furthermore, that subject has to refer to or have an antecedent which is the same as the subject of the higher clause. So in the end what we get is John appears and then some abstract subject which refers to John of like to like himself, and himself refers to that abstract subject and that abstract subject refers to John. The final observation, which also suggests that there really is a subject of this lower clause, concerns these things called floating quantifiers. If you remember, a floating quantifier is a small set of quantifiers which are associated with an element that can either move with that element when it moves, or it can be left behind and stranded in the original position. Take these examples here. We've got all the men as the experiencer of like, and then we can either move that into the subject position as a whole and we get all the men should like Mary, or you can just move the part the men and leave the all behind, and then you get the men should all like Mary. And in that case we see that the quantifier appears to have floated away from the subject, but in fact it's actually the subject that's moved away from the quantifier. Now, modifying our examples to include a floating quantifier, we can see that, well, in that lower clause there must have been a subject inside that VP because we can get a floated quantifier there. The quantifier marks the original position of something before it moves, and so the fact that we've got this all element following the inflection to, i.e. therefore inside the verb phrase, means that there must have been a subject that has moved away from there. Moreover, you can also get the floated quantifier in front of the two. So the men appear all to like Mary, and the men try all to be happy. That all is clearly sitting in the specifier position of the lower IP, in front of the inflection, which not only means that the subject started off inside the VP and moved, but it also moved to that position which appears to be empty. So there really is something that has moved to that position, and the all element in that position shows that it's actually there. So it looks as though then, in these cases, there really isn't a missing subject. It's just we can't see it. Okay, so let's have a look then at how we could analyze these sentences to see what's actually going on. The first thing to point out is that the two cases that we've been looking at so far are actually different from each other. Here they are. John appears to be well and John expects to be well. We've got appear in one case and expect in the other. Otherwise, they look to be similar to each other. But if we have a look at the properties of those two verbs, appear and expect, we see that they're actually different. Appear can appear in a kind of structure like this. This is the one where we've got the subject position filled by one of these pleonastic subjects. So we get, it appears that John is well. And looking at that sentence, we can see quite clearly that appear is a verb that has just one argument. That argument is the sentence, John is well, and its subject position doesn't contain any argument. A pleonastic subject can't be an argument because arguments obviously refer to things. They are really meaningful things, and this is a meaningless thing, so it can't be an argument. So there's only one argument of appear. In other words, that clause that follows it is its argument. The thing that comes in front of it is not an argument. So appear is a one-place predicate, a predicate that only has one argument. Now, expect, on the other hand, can't appear with a meaningless subject. Okay, so it expects John is well, can't mean the same as it appears that John is well in terms of the interpretation of the subject. If this sentence means is grammatical at all, then that it is not a meaningless it. That it is an actual meaningful pronoun, it referring to some non-human, perhaps not even animate element, if such things can have the experience of expecting anything. Okay, so it's a strange meaning, but it certainly does not mean the same as the it in the it appears case, i.e. it's not meaningless. So what that actually shows us then is that the verb expect is different from the verb appear in as much as it has two arguments. And as we can see in this example here, those two arguments are separate things. I is the one who's doing the expecting, and that John is well is what is expected. So expect then has two arguments, the one who expects, the experiencer of the expectation, and the theme of what is actually expected. It's a two-place predicate in that case. Now that difference between these two verbs has consequences for how we analyse these sentences. John appears to be well and John expects to be well, and it means that they have to be analysed in very different ways. Let's start off with the first one. This involves something which we refer to as raising, and we'll see why it's called raising in a short while. This is the case of the appear. Okay, we've seen that appear is a one-place predicate, and its argument is a sentence. From a semantic point of view, a sentence is referred to as a proposition. The meaning of a sentence is a proposition. And a proposition is defined as a predicate plus its full set of arguments. Now, semantically, this is often represented in the following way. You have the predicate first, and then some brackets, and then the set of arguments that predicate requires following it. So, for example, a sentence like John loves Mary, from its semantic point of view, can be represented like this. We've got love as the predicate, and John and Mary as the two arguments. and that then would represent the meaning of the proposition John loves Mary. Now, given that the appear takes as its argument a proposition, we can represent the meaning of it appears that John loves Mary by putting appear as the predicate of the main thing and its argument inside those brackets being the proposition John loves Mary. Okay, so we can build up the meaning of this sentence in this particular way. Now, how that relates to syntax is that propositions can be realized syntactically by different categories. So mostly we've been looking at propositions that are realized as CPs. Okay, but we have seen a couple of propositions that are represented as verb phrases, and indeed there can be propositions represented as adjectival phrases. So for example, in the first case, I think that John is intelligent. That John is intelligent here is a CP. Note, that's a finite clause, but you can also have the same thing with a non-finite clause, as in I expect John to be intelligent. John to be intelligent there is also a CP, and it's an infinitive with the infinitive to. So a proposition can be realized either as a finite or a non-finite clause. In the next example, that made John be intelligent, we've got John be intelligent, which we've argued is a verb phrase following these kind of causative verbs like to make or to let or to have. We get VP complements, and as you can see, John be intelligent has a verb in it, but it doesn't have any inflection. There's no tense or no possible modal there. There's no to, the infinitive possible, so it's just a verb phrase. Now we can go one step smaller than that and just have John intelligent in the complement position of a verb like consider. I consider John intelligent. You've got something that means pretty much the same thing. It has the same proposition. We've got the predicate intelligent and its argument John. So these constructions all express exactly the same proposition. It's just that they all have different elements in them. The smallest one has just got the predicate and its argument and is just an AP. The next one has an additional verb and therefore is a VP, and the others have extra things like inflections and complementizers and things like that, and therefore are CPs. Now, let's turn to our verb appear. Note that the propositional argument of appear can only be represented as a CP or an AP. It doesn't have VP propositions. So you can say it appears that John is intelligent, or John appears to be intelligent, where the CP proposition is either finite or non-finite. There is a difference between those two, but we'll come back to that in a short while. We can't have the verb phrase, so you can't say it appears John be intelligent, but you can have the adjectival phrase, John appears intelligent. Okay, and again, what we've got here is something similar to the non-finite clause, John appears to be intelligent, where the argument of the intelligent is actually not inside the propositional part of this clause, the CP in the first case and the AP in the second case, but is outside that in the subject position of the verb appear. Now, so let's look at what's going on there. When the clause complement of the verb appear, when the argument proposition is a finite clause, as in that John is intelligent, note that you have to have this pleonastic subject it in the subject position of appear. And you can't put the subject of the lower clause in that position. So you can say it appears that John is intelligent, but you can't say John appears that is intelligent. However, when the proposition argument is non-finite, say an infinitive, then you've got to put the subject of that lower clause in the subject position of appear. So John appears to be intelligent, and you can't have an it there and leave the John back inside the complement clause. You can't say it appears John to be intelligent. So it looks as though finite clauses and non-finite clauses work in exactly the opposite way to each other. With finite clauses, the subject of the proposition or argument is in the subject position of that clause, but with a non-finite clause, it looks as though that subject has been moved. It's actually outside of the clause and into the higher one. We could therefore argue that what's going on here is again another instance of a movement. Okay. So John appears to be intelligent. John has moved out of the lower clause into the higher clause. That's why this process is often referred to as raising, because you raise the subject out of the lower clause and put it into the higher clause. And with the AP proposition, exactly the same seems to happen. So John appears to be intelligent. You can't leave the John behind inside the AP and fill the subject with an it and get it appears John intelligent. Okay, you've got to raise the subject out of that AP proposition. Okay, so let's have a look at the details of the analysis then. If we've got a finite lower clause like we have here, and this is just the bare bones of the structure, so we've got the whole thing is a CP with an IP with an unfilled subject position. It's a finite clause with a present tense S in its inflection position, and the verb phrase is appear with just one argument, which is a CP. That CP has an IP with an empty subject before anything moves. It has an inflection and a verb phrase which is contentful. John loves Mary. Now, I won't go into the details there just to avoid going to the complexities of the verb phrase structure, but we've got John, love and Mary inside a verb phrase. What's going to have to happen here is, well, obviously the inflections are going to have to be supported. Appear will move to support the S of the higher one, so we've got appears. Now we've also got a subject position of the lower clause, and that, as we've seen, has to be filled. So we're going to move John into that position there. Love is going to move to support the lower inflection. Okay, but we've still got a subject position of the upper clause that needs to be filled. Now here, as I've said, with a finite clause in that lower position, what has to happen here is that the higher subject position is replaced by it. So we insert this meaningless it, and we again end up with it appears that John loves Mary. Now, let's look at what happens if that lower clause isn't finite, but is non-finite and has got a to in it. Okay, well, exactly the same is true of the upper part of the clause. Appear is going to have to move to support that inflection. We've still got two empty subject positions, so John is going to have to move into the lower position to fill that position. Note 2 isn't a bound morpheme, so that's not going to cause love to move anywhere. Love stays where it is. Now this time, instead of filling that upper subject position with a meaningless subject, what actually happens is that John undergoes this raising movement. Okay, raising from the lower clause to the higher clause. Now apparently having moved into the lower clause position is enough to satisfy the requirement that that subject position is filled, even if it then gets vacated again by another movement. So essentially what we're getting here then is that one element is satisfying the requirement that the IP specifier is filled by something. So you can do it twice by moving John into the lower one first and then raising it into the higher one. Okay, let's now turn to our verb expect. This, as we've seen, is different, and the phenomena that is involved here is often referred to as control. Again, we'll see what that means when we get to it. The semantics of expect are, as we've seen, that expect itself is a two-place predicate. It has two arguments, an experiencer and a proposition. So Bill expects that John loves Mary. Bill is the experiencer and the proposition is John loves Mary. Semantically, we can represent that like this. So expect is the predicate with two arguments, Bill, and a proposition, which is made up of love, John and Mary. So John loves Mary. Okay, Bill is the experiencer, and the proposition John loves Mary is the second argument. Now, the syntax is a little less complicated with a peer, because a peer can only have a CP representing its propositional argument. It can't have a VP or an AP. So I expect that John is intelligent. We can have a finite clause there. Or I expect John to be intelligent. We can have a non-finite clause there. But we can't say I expect John be intelligent or I expect John intelligent. Okay, so a peer only has one kind of way of representing its propositional argument, and that's as a CP, be a finite or a non-finite one. Now, with the finite CP, the subject has to appear in the lower clause. So it's got I expect John is intelligent, but you can't say I expect that is intelligent. You can't have an unrealized subject of that lower clause. However, with expect in particular, when it's got a non-finite CP argument, the subject appears to be optional. So you can say I expect John to be intelligent or I expect to be intelligent. Note in that second case, the meaning is that it's me that is going to be intelligent and it's me that is doing the expecting. Okay. In the other case, obviously the two subjects refer to different things. I expect John to be intelligent, and I refers to one person and John refers to another. Okay. Now, let's point out why we can't analyze this in the same way as we've analyzed the case of raising. This cannot involve a movement. Here's the bare bones of the structure. This time, however, we've got Bill sitting in the subject position of the higher clause. Obviously, Bill originates inside the VP with expect and then moves to that position, but I've missed out that step just to simplify things and to concentrate on what's important. Okay, so we've got an inflection, which is a bound morpheme, and expect is going to move to support that. We've got lower down an inflection, which is a free morpheme, so nothing's going to happen there. We've also got an IP with a missing, with an empty IP specifier position, and John from inside the verb phrase is going to move to there. Okay. Now, it's fairly clear at that point that we can't further raise John higher, well, because there's already an element in that position. So it simply cannot raise because that position is already going to be filled. And it's going to be filled precisely because expect is a two-place predicate. It has an argument that moves into that subject position. So it's clear then we can't have a raising analysis of this clause. Okay, the subject of the embedded clause can't move because the higher subject position is already filled. Okay. Furthermore, you can't not have that subject there. And the reason for that is because the higher subject position is related semantically to expect. Expect has to have two arguments, and therefore there must be an argument in that higher position. Remember, every semantic role must be borne by an argument. So you can't not have an argument and leave that position free. Furthermore, that argument cannot be John, because an argument has to originate inside the verb phrase associated with its predicate, and an argument can't be in two places at once. Here, John is associated with the argument with the predicate love, so it can't be associated with the predicate expect as well. Okay, so clearly then we can't apply any kind of movement analysis and say that John starts off in the lower clause and moves to the higher clause, because that just violates all sorts of principles. Okay, so how are we to analyze this? Well, let's take a look again at those cases where we've got either an overt subject of a non-finite clause or a subject which we can't see. Okay, so John expects Bill to arrive on time. That one's fairly straightforward. Bill is the person who's going to do the arriving. John is the person who's doing the expecting. Okay, then we've got John expects to arrive on time. John is the one clearly doing the expecting, but we also get the interpretation that John is the one who's arriving. Okay, so it means that John expects John to arrive on time. Clearly you can't say that though, and the reason for that is names and nouns that have reference can't have antecedents. You can't put a word like John with the same referent as indicated here by these indexes in the same sentence. Okay, the only way of interpreting this sentence would be to assume that there are actually two Johns, in which case they would have two different indexes, John 1 and John 2. Okay, so this John expects that John to arrive on time. When the two refer to the same individual, it can't work. So even though it means this, you can't express it in this way. However, how you can express it is by using a pronoun. In this case, a reflexive pronoun. Remember, reflexive pronouns have antecedents. They refer to the same, to some element. Okay, so John expects himself to arrive on time. It'd be exactly how we need to pronounce the meaning of this sentence, because what we have there is two different arguments. We've got John and himself, two different elements occupying different positions, and they're connected to each other by the referential properties of the reflexive pronoun. The reflexive pronoun takes its reference from somewhere else. So what we seem to need then is exactly this. We want a pronoun in that subject position. John expects pronoun to arrive on time. That pronoun takes its reference from John. The only difference between the pronoun that we need here and a pronoun like himself is precisely the fact that you pronounce himself, where this pronoun apparently goes unpronounced. Now, we call an unpronounced pronoun, particularly the one that sits in the subject of a non-finite clause, pro short for pronoun. It means an unpronounced pronoun. It's actually written in capital letters, so it's often referred to as big pro. That's because it has a smaller brother, little pro, written in little letters, which we're not going to go into here because, well, English doesn't have make use of such an element, but there are many languages that do, and it differs from this one in ways which have nothing to do with what we're talking about. So for now, then, we'll just assume there is this unpronounced pronoun called big pro that sits in that position. Okay, let's look at the details of the analysis. This unpronounced pronoun is the argument of love, the one who experiences this emotion of love, and then starts off inside the verb phrase just like any other argument does. We've got John as the argument of expect, and again we've put that directly into the IP to skip out a few steps in this analysis so we don't get confused. Expect is going to move to support the inflection, and we're going to get John expects something. We've got a lower IP position that needs to be filled by something, and that's exactly what pro does. Pro will move into that position. Now obviously, given that you don't pronounce it, you won't actually see any element there, but that's where it is. And that pro element has a referential property that it takes its reference from John. So we end up with John expects to love Mary, meaning John expects himself to love Mary. Okay, now there's some observations which show us that we actually have to assume that what's going on here is a pronoun taking its reference from an element rather than a movement. And that comes from the following observations. Note here we've got two, again, very similar looking sentences, but they actually, again, are different. John persuaded Bill to go to the party, and John promised Bill to go to the party. word by word. They look the same except that one's got persuade and one's got promise. But if you think a little deeper into this, we can see that they're different in terms of who it is that's going to the party. That is, the identity of the pronoun pro that is unpronounced. In the first case, the identity of the pronoun, the reference of the pronoun, comes from Bill, the object of persuade. Okay, we call this object control because the notion control is to do with what the pronoun takes its reference from. Here we say it's the object that's controlling the reference of pro, so it gets interpreted as John persuaded Bill that Bill should go to the party. On the other hand, with promise, it's actually John who is the one going to go to the party. John promised Bill that John would go to the party. So here it's the subject of promise which is the controller, and we call this control subject control. Promise is a subject control verb and persuade is an object control verb. It's to do with the verbs themselves as to which of their arguments acts as the controller. Now, why does this lead us to the conclusion that this has to be to do with pronoun reference and not movement? Well, it's exactly the existence of object control that shows that it can't be a movement, and that's simply because nothing ever moves to an object position. There's no structure in any language where we get a movement out of some position into an object position. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first thing is that an object position, unlike a subject position, is actually a thematic position. The object position is that position inside the VP that is associated with a predicate. It's the theme position, basically. And that position is always going to be filled whenever there's a theme. And therefore, nothing can move into it because there's always going to be something there. Now, if there isn't a theme, however, there's no actual grammatical requirement that then the object position has to be filled by something. If there's no theme, there's nothing in that position. In fact, there's no position there. And we can see that by the fact that there's no requirement that there be an it or something stuck into the object position when there's no object. So you don't say John smiled it. Okay. This is very different from the subject position. Remember, the subject position actually isn't a thematic position. It's a position in the specifier of the IP that is underlyingly empty. There's no argument in it at all. So it's not a thematic position associated with a particular argument, but it gets filled by arguments. And it could be, in principle, any argument that moves there. It can be a theme, it can be an agent, it could be an experiencer, it could even be a goal under certain circumstances. So any argument can actually move there. It's not a thematic position. Okay, and there is a requirement that it be filled by something, and therefore that's why we get pleonastic subjects. Okay. So the fact that nothing could possibly move to an object position and the existence of object control then is a strong argument that this isn't a case of movement but a case of something else, and the only other possibility that it could be, the only way to link two positions with one referential element is through the use of a pronoun. So we can see we've got evidence here that there really is a pronoun there. Okay, to summarise then what we've said, there's two ways in which subject can appear to be missing. Either it moves, or there's an unpronounced pronoun in that position. The first case we call raising, the second case we call control. Some verbs are associated with raising. We call those raising verbs. They're verbs like to seem and to appear. They're basically one-place predicates, and their argument is a clause, a propositional argument. They have no argument that moves to the subject position itself. So no argument of these predicates themselves moves into that subject position. But, as we know, that subject position has to be filled. You can either do it by using a meaningless it subject, and you get that whenever that clausal complement, the clausal argument, is a finite one, Or you can borrow the subject of that clause and move it into the subject position of the raising verb. Okay, so that happens when you've got a non-finite clausal argument. You get the raising of the lower subject into the higher subject position. Other verbs, however, are associated with control. They're called control verbs. Things like expect, try, want, persuade, and promise. As you can see, there's actually more control verbs than there are raising verbs. Raising verbs, it's only actually a handful of verbs which work like that, but there are quite a number of control verbs. These differ from raising verbs in as much as they're two-place predicates. One of their arguments is a DP, and that's precisely the thing which occupies the subject position of these verbs. The second one is, like the raising verb, a propositional argument, so it's a clause. The DP argument then moves to the subject position, and therefore raising just cannot happen with these verbs. The propositional argument then can either be non-finite or finite. When it's non-finite, that's the case where it can have this unpronounced pronoun subject, which we call pro, and that takes its reference from some other argument higher up in the clause, depending what there is. Sometimes that will be the subject, sometimes it will be the object. Okay, that's enough for today, and I will see you in class. Bye-bye.